the question, if Lupa, if you want, you can ask directly the question, or I can read it. You can open your microphone and directly.
Yes, yes, please. Thank you. I'm asking a question. Temperature activities in these like mountains have shown us in some situations. Dangerous activities are higher. Concentration are high at ends. Then the second question is temperature increasing in countries where they low. Low countries, does it increase rather than increase?
You're fading in and out, and I can't hear you. Were you able to hear it? Because he was fading in and out for me.
Okay, I can read because the question is also in the chat. So
good.
I can read the first one. Then after your answer, I'll read the second one. So the first one is looking at some of the climate and temperature activities in these areas, like mountains you have shown us. Can afforestation take place, such ice and glacier situation? It also looks like extreme dangerous activities has gone higher on these areas. Do your mineral concentration are high and then streams?
Yeah, well, you're talking about afforestation in these areas because of warming. Well, I think there is a great opportunity, and it's actually happening, and our Italian experts will tell you probably more about it. The forests are actually moving up into the mountains. But the biggest challenge we're facing is, should we let nature do this at a very slow pace? Or should we help nature by planting the trees, taking trees from lower elevation to higher elevation to speed this process up? This is a very interesting conundrum, because I'm not sure what the right answer is, because I'm not a forestry expert, but this is something you need to consider. Does that answer your question?
Yes. The second one is you have shown temperatures increasing also in countries where they have been low. So what happened to dryland countries? Does it increase or it lowers rather?
Well, you look at the Middle East and the record temperatures, many of the record temperatures have actually occurred in the dry part. I was a couple of years ago working in Iran in one of the river basins which feeds the second biggest saline lake, and that lake has actually shrunk by 60%. And the temperatures have increased there probably even faster than in our part of the world. But we have very few climate stations at high elevation. As you heard yesterday, most of the climate stations, you know, the European Alps have the best climate network anywhere in the world. The Italians and the Swiss, they have so many climate stations, and even then we still have some difficulties in predicting precipitation. But the temperature is clearly evident anywhere in the world, even in the dry parts, they're increasing very rapidly.
Okay, I say thanks.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll tell you a little bit what I know about adaptation, or I'll try to show you how we are trying to educate some of the communities on how they should start thinking about adapting to these changes and rehabilitation. So I mentioned to you is increased climatic variability, increased demand and limited resource supply, and increased land use intensification. So here is what the combination of climate change and land use change is doing to the hydrological cycle. We're creating more floods, we're creating more droughts, we're creating more wildfires, we're creating all kinds of disease problems, which you probably haven't thought about. But as you get higher temperatures, you're going to have more problems with disease. And this is particularly the case in forestry, where we had all kinds of problems, which I will show you later, with pine beetle infestation. And that was clearly related to climate change. And then we also have much more windstorms. And unfortunately, you can't see this right now, but last year, during the IPROMO field trip, we were shown some devastating windstorms, even in the European Alps, which you wouldn't have expected. So the floods, it's not just that the increase in intensity of precipitation is happening, but we also are changing the surface. In terms of drought, yes, we have higher precipitation, higher temperatures and lower precipitation, but we're also changing the water holding capacity of the soil by doing monoculture and by doing all kinds of vegetation issues. In terms of wildfires, we have not managed the big forested areas very well because we left a lot of branches and ground cover, which is creating a high fuel load, which stresses, and also the pollution is stressing the vegetation, or the temperatures are stressing the vegetation. And many of the trees are old and poor and decrepit like me, and they're very fragile. So if there is a spark, then you get all kinds of problems. And remember, wildfires not only happen from people, but in our part of the world, it's about 50-50 people versus lightning strikes. In terms of disease, we have basically created a lot of forests which are monocultures, plantation forests. They're even-aged and they're very susceptible to all kinds of diseases when the temperatures increase. I will show you the example in my part of the world where we always had pine beetle. We have a lot of pine forests. We always have pine beetles. But when there was a year of very cold winters, -30 and so on, they were cut, the beetle were cut back, and then they used to come back a little bit. But we haven't had, for the last 10 years or 20 years, we haven't had very cold winters of -30 for at least a month. And so they were just able to just eat themselves like you would overdo eating too many hamburgers. And so that created a devastating tree mortality, which then was perfect material for fire. And I will show you this later. And then the windstorms, of course, we often have certain kinds of trees which have very shallow roots. And with these new intensive storms, some of the trees are more susceptible to windstorms than others. So we need to think about that as well. So these are the kind of things we need to think about when we start looking at how do we adapt to these new conditions. So the infrastructure is the critical part for oops, I better go back here. The infrastructure is the critical part. Drinking water, wastewater, housing, stormwater, electrical grid, bridges, roads, and so on. Those are the things we need to start thinking about when we adapt to these climatic events. And then the risk is due to fire. The risk is on the water supply. The risk is because of drought and flooding, and obviously landslides. And landslides are not only from intensive flooding events, we now have lots of landslides in the summertime without precipitation. How do you explain that? Melting permafrost. Some of the rocks are held back on the mountains because they're frozen. And as the permafrost melts, all of a sudden you get all kinds of events. And Danilo is the expert on all this, and he can enlighten you on all these processes. And then, of course, we need to look at an adaptive option method. Green infrastructure, water conservation, innovative stormwater management, fire prevention, all of these are adaptive measures. So we had the opportunity in 2007 with the Columbia Basin Trust, to look at how could we engage communities to start thinking about adapting to climate change. And so we started with about 3 communities in 2008 to 2010, and we worked with them and said, look, what kind of climate events are happening in your community, and what should we actually start thinking about doing to prevent the impact? And then that was reasonably successful. Then we expanded it to 3 other ones, and then to 3 other ones. And now I'm totally out of it. They have now 20 communities who actually have an adaptation plan to actually address the climate change. So just to show you some of these kind of events, which I experienced this one. This is the main highway through the mountains. And there was a mud flow, which to me was fascinating and wonderful, and I was totally excited, and everybody else was totally depressed because we were stuck for 3 days because we couldn't move. Because when you get a mud flow, this is like liquid jello. It keeps flowing, so the bulldozers come and move it, and more and more and more is coming, and it took about 2 days for it to stop. So the community process we talked about is, first of all, we brought in some of the experts to talk about what is happening to climate change. And then we sat down with the community planners and said, what are your priorities in terms of risk? Where is the risk the greatest? And how vulnerable are you? And then we develop an adaptive strategy and an action plan, and then they need to implement the monitoring program. So just to give you an idea, here's the modeling which he showed them. He said, look, your annual temperatures between the 90s and the 2100s, this is how it's going to change. This precipitation is going to change from the 90s to the 2050. This is how the frost-free days is changing from high to low, which means we have now opportunities for forestry, opportunities for agriculture, and so on. Growing degree days, from very few growing degree days in the mountains to a much better situation. So we presented all this detailed information, not just the general stuff, to the communities. And then we said, here is the approach which you can use to come up with a risk assessment. So the idea is, where are you exposed to climate events? Do you have a flooding problem? Do you have a bridge or a road which could be subject to flooding and then destroy the access? And then you need to say, well, how sensitive is it? Is it going to be a high, low, or medium sensitive situation? And then you can look at, if it happens, what is the impact? And then you say, well, could we actually do something? Do we have the capacity to do something about it? In some cases, we don't have adaptive capacity. For example, if you look at air pollution, we don't have adaptive capacity. It comes from somewhere else. So once you know the potential, then you can look at how vulnerable are things, and then the probability of occurrence, that gives you the risk tolerance, and then you can set the priority. So the vulnerability is the exposure times the sensitivity times the adaptive capacity. So let me show you how show you how this complicated graph works. So we ask the communities, what are your big issues? What are your priorities in terms of climate change? Here are 5 communities, the first 5 we worked with. The highest priority was water availability, drinking water and water for use. Second highest, depending on where you go, some had flooding issues, some had food security issues, some had fire issues, and so on. So each community set the highest priority, second, third, and fourth, categorizing it. So in terms of these 5 communities, the highest priority was the water availability, the second highest was fires, the third flooding, and the fourth food security. What was the extent of the problem? Shortages in winter and shortages in summer, and increases and decreases in drought, which obviously is the extent of the problem, and so on. And then we came up with this kind of thing, which tells you here is the sensitivity and adaptive capacity and vulnerability. So sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and vulnerability. So for flooding of buildings, it's highly sensitive, has low adaptive capacity, and is high. The damage to the bridge is high. You can't do much about it, so the vulnerability is very high. Stormwater management and stress, moderate, high, low, and so on. So we can do this very easily, and then we can produce this, which is the vulnerability index versus the probability of it to happen. So the red, it means you're highly vulnerable, and it's highly probable that this will happen. So if you have a bridge and you have a very clear indication that your river is going to flood almost every 3 or 4 years, then you're up in this category. So they put all their problems, the infrastructure problems, into these categories. So they said, well, flooding of buildings and land and flooding on the bridge, this is very, very important. The bridge is much more probable to happen than the housing is more probable than the bridge. In terms of wildfire, the same situation, vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity. You can look at all the kind of issues with wildfire, which they said is incredibly important, like there was a mine in the vicinity, and if the fire happens, then that's a huge disaster. It's a moderate disaster, or it's moderately sensitive, but a high vulnerability, and so on. You can do this again for the wildfire extent. You can see backcountry forest closure is a high probability and will likely to occur, whereas evacuation for the towns or for the mine closure is highly vulnerable, but it might not happen very often because it's high up in the mountains where there is very little forest. So this is the kind of planning principle which the communities adapted to come up with a plan. Here is something about water quality, which everybody was worried about for their drinking water. They could look at how do we decrease the water, why is the water quality declining, why is the availability declining, and so on and so on. Here is why it's sensitive, here's what the adaptive capacity is, and this is how vulnerable we are. And then you come up with this kind of thing. So this method was actually adapted reasonably well, because the first community we did this with is a mining community, and they put it into their official development plan, and they started assigning finances to actually initiate these priorities. And then the UN actually picked it up as one of their case studies on how mountain communities can adapt to climate change. So obviously the water supply was shown to be very critical to most of these communities. And then you need to have very specific adaptation methods, because the water supply is very different for every community. Some communities have a reservoir, some communities have a lake, some communities have springs, some have rivers, some have groundwater, and some have roof water. They collect the rain and use it for drinking water. So each one has to have a different strategy on how to protect that source from all these climate events. So in terms of drinking water, different water sources need different protection. So for streams, in order to protect your stream, you first of all need to have land use regulations that you don't allow people to develop within the floodplain or within the river buffer zone. You need to minimize how much pollution and how much sediment gets into your water supply stream, because if you use stream water, the people who use it for drinking water have to get rid of the sediment. If you put very large buffer zones, you vegetate the buffer zones on both sides of your stream, that can help you tremendously with absorbing sediments and pollution. You can revegetate degraded areas, you can stabilize stream banks, and you can restrict animal access to the stream because they all create kind of pathogen problems. For springs and groundwater, the adaptive measures are different. What you need to do there is you need to have a buffer zone around your wellhead, which means don't put manure or intensive agriculture or anything like septic systems right on top of your wellhead. And you have to make sure that what you're putting onto the land is minimum. And then you have to monitor how much you're extracting, because every year the groundwater is being recharged, and in the summer you pump it up. You need to make sure that what you're pumping up is less than what's coming back. And then for roof water, which is happening in many developing parts of the world, you can actually collect roof water for drinking water, and we now have the technology to do that. But you have to be very careful, because you have to clean your roof after the dry season, because during the dry season, all kinds of stuff accumulates on the roof surface, including pathogens from animals and birds. And you also need to be careful the material which you use for your roof, because if you use an aluminum or a galvanized roof, then you got lots of sink problems and so on. And you also have to have a device that after 5 or 6 days of dry periods, you get all of kind of dust accumulating on your roof. And then the rain comes, so the first 15 minutes or the first 10 minutes of the storm is highly polluted with sediment. And then what you need to do is simply have a first flush removal system which can remove that first flush, and then that works reasonably well. And I will show you some examples later on when we talk about conservation. So the thing you need to remember, protecting streams and people who use stream water, this is stupid. So what they done here is, there was a flood, so they built up a bank. Then there was another flood, then they built up the bank. And then there was another flood, they built up the bank. And so how much more can you build up? Remember, we demolished the Berlin Wall because we don't like walls. Why do we build all these incredible infrastructures in mountains when we should actually let the river flow naturally? And this is best explained here. If you channelize a river, these are the only 3 functions which a river can do. If you let it naturally flow, you can see all these other things which can happen to your stream. Like the water can actually go into the side, recharge groundwater, is detained, and improves the habitat and cleans up all kinds of things. So remember, channelizing river, you need to do it in certain places where you have no choice. But if you do it everywhere, you just accelerate the problem from climate change. because it's going to be much faster flowing. And, you know, they put in these obstructions here to create fish habitat. That's not going to help you when you have these intensive storms. So when we say buffer zones, the science is telling us buffer zones can have all kinds of good protection for the streams. First of all, it reduces, if you have a vegetated buffer zone on both sides of the stream, it reduces the noise. It moderates the water temperatures, and that's very, very important, because as rivers warm up, all the aquatic organisms are affected, so we can actually moderate the water temperatures in the small streams by having very tall trees growing on both sides of the stream to shade the stream. And this can actually reduce your water temperatures by 2 to 3 degrees. But you need a certain buffer zone in order to do that, right? For removing sediments, if you have lots of forests and grassland on both sides, it will hold the sediment back, it will hold the pollution back, it will create diversity, and it will help you to produce wetlands, which wetlands are the best water storage and the best filtering systems we have. They're far better than all the treatment we do. So if you really want to have a protection of a river, you need at least 50, 70, maybe 90 meters of buffer zones on both sides of the river. And so that depends. Basically, it's a compromise between the politics and the public acceptability. We have a 30-meter buffer zone requirement. So every stream has to have 30 meters of vegetation and buffer. And yet science tells us we need at least a 50 to 70 meter to have all these functions taking place. So here's an example. Here's urbanization on both sides. And here is a very well-defined buffer zone. This is a 30-meter buffer zone. See, it's pretty good, except here's a bit of an intrusion. Here is a road coming across, so that's not too good. But if you now go to a 100-meter buffer zone, then you can see we should actually vegetate this area in order to protect the stream properly. Now, in many parts of the world, particularly in Switzerland, they have channelized the rivers all through the 50s and 60s and 70s because they wanted to protect flooding. So they channelized all the rivers, and now we're actually going back and saying we should give the river more space. So in this case, here's an example where they bought the land, the agricultural land on this side, they bought it on both sides and opened up the river. So now you've got places where sediment can accumulate, but the big problem is if you only do this in one part, it has virtually no effect. So you need to do this in many other parts. So if you do have a river which is being considered for channelization, don't do it. Make sure you got a very wide buffer zone, because once it's established, it is so expensive to get back to a kind of a wide buffer zone that you can't really do it. Let me go back 1 second. The other thing which is happening now, and this is very important in mountains, is how do we deal with these floods? In the past, we said, well, we channelize it and move the problem downstream. So what we're saying now is we should actually detain some of that runoff in all parts of the watershed, wherever you have a depressional area. Store the water temporarily during peak flow and then release it at low flow. This is called design flood. And this is happening now in many parts of the world. And I will show you a good example in the Mississippi later on where they have done this very effectively. So I mentioned to you wetlands are the best water storage and the best filtering system. we have removed wetlands in most countries at an incredible rate. If you look at the wetlands in 1900, and you look at how much is left now, you will see it almost in every country, it has shrunk to a very small proportion. Yet, we're now starting to create wetlands to store and protect and filter pollution in all kinds of municipalities. So here's an example where we actually created wetlands to store water during storm events and during peak flows, and then create the biodiversity and store the water and filter the water. So you can actually detain and store stormwater in urban communities by building wetlands, collecting sediments, retain and filter pollutions, take up excess nutrients from the plants. Phytoremediation means some of these plants can actually take up metals and store them in the leaves, which means you can actually every 2 or 3 years remove part of the biomass. So you dilute it so that it doesn't create, and it creates a lot of recreational opportunities. We have created, at least with my students, about 15 of these wetlands, and they've been a tremendous success in reducing the flooding problems in some of the communities. Windstorms are a big issue. We had one in our part of the world in 2008, where it decapitated 2,500 trees in the best park in the city. And most of these trees were between 100 to 250 years old. I actually went out afterwards and counted the tree rings. So these trees survived 250 years and never got decapitated except during that storm. And the intensity of these storms is obviously increasing, as you will probably hear from our Italian colleagues. This is actually the example in the Italian Alps, which we visited last year, showing you where all this windstorm happened and how it happened, and very interesting experience. So fires are a particular problem because when there is a fire and you have lots of coniferous forest, it creates what we call hydrophobicity. That means the surface of the soil, which has been the organic matter which has been burned, particularly the needles, they become water repellent. They don't allow the water to go through the soil. So it reduces the infiltration. It leads to much more erosion after the fire. It increases, of course, the stream flow and the sediment problems. And you get a nutrient flush, particularly nitrate, for the first year after the fire. And it obviously increases the organic carbon content in the water, which is not very good. So there are all kinds of problems which happen with forest fires, which we need to start thinking about how to prevent this. So this gives you an idea what is happening in my part of the world. This is since 1998. This is the hectares of annual areas affected by fire, hectares per year. In 2017 and 2018, we had 1.2 million hectares which were burned in the northern part of my province. And in 2018, it was almost 1.4 million hectares. This is the size, these two areas is the size of Denmark, totally burned. And what is also happening is the average area per fire is increasing, which means the fires are more intense and much larger than they were ever before. If you have heard the news of California, they have the worst fire. They had the worst fire 2 years ago, and this year they have an even worse fire happening. So when you look at in my parts of the world, remember, I'll go back 1 second. 2017, 2018, we had the highest fires. Look at what has happened to temperature and precipitation. 2018 and 2017 were the hottest and the driest. And different parts, same thing. So that contributed to this whole. But this is what happened to the pine beetle. We always had pine beetle, as I mentioned, and because it has become much warmer, between 1999 and 2014, we had 14 million hectares, twice the size of Austria, being affected by pine beetle. We have massive forests in Canada, and you can see the infestation was huge. So the big dilemma was, what do you do with all these dead trees? If you harvest them within the first or second or third year, you can still use the wood. If you leave it standing and being dead pine, this is a huge forest fire hazard. All you need is a lightning strike and you got a massive fire. So the big dilemma for the government was, well, if we leave it, it's a fire hazard for all the communities, so we can still harvest it and use it if we do it fast. So we decided to harvest it, but it was such a large area that we were never able to get all the dead trees. So then we had these big fires. So the climate contributed to the disease, contributed to the land use change, and in both cases, it created a huge carbon problem. Because we are now aware that these forest fires create far more carbon, CO2 equivalent, than even all the transport in my province. So here is the example I'm trying to show you. This is the pine beetle infestation. It peaked in 2005. The animals ate up all the food, and by 2012 they had no food, so that was the end of the pine beetle. And then we started the afforestation. We started logging, and you can see the fire. This is the fire situation. So about 4 or 5 years later, because we had all these dead trees, we had the highest fire example. And again, these were the driest years and the hottest years. And so if you look at the wildfire season in 2017, 1.2 million hectares, the fire emission was 176 million tons. The human emission from in my province was 64. So that is almost 3 times the emission of all the human activity in my province. In 2018, same situation. So these forest fires have a huge impact. And if you listen to the news of Russia this last winter, they had these massive fires in the Arctic. And so this is something which we have really not considered sufficiently in the climate forecast projection for CO2. So this is the most updated information till the 1st of September in the west coast of the United States from California, Oregon, and Washington. And the red is the total area for forest fires since 2001. So look at the red bars. This is what has happened in the last few years in terms of fire along the west coast. And this is not finished yet. And the fires are still burning in all of the areas. And a few days ago, we actually got a lot of smoke. We don't have fires this year, but we got a lot of smoke being blown in our part of the world. So keep that in mind when you think about forest fires. So how do we mitigate all these forest fire risks? Here are the factors that promote wildfires, and this is how we mitigate it. So don't plant flammable trees. Some trees are much more susceptible to fires than others. So plant fire-resistant trees if you can. Make sure the fuel load doesn't build up, which means you have to control the understory and the dead branches in your forest. Insect-damaged trees should be removed, because if you don't remove them, they're a huge fire hazard. Trees actually get stressed by high temperatures, and that makes them more vulnerable to fires. So you need to do selective biomass extraction when you have very hot conditions coming. You might have to thin some of your forests. Extended drought conditions could help you by promoting grazing, where the animals eat some of the grasses, which also contribute to the fire. Tree stress by pollution, obviously you need to have fire breaks. Increased temperatures, you should have prescribed burns, deliberately burn it so to create fire breaks. Because we have a decrease in precipitation, you should actually remove the dead branches if you can. Less snow. You could actually increase the snow accumulation by changing the way you have your forests. If you open up the forest in small pockets, you make small openings, more snow accumulates in these openings than in the forest, because in the forest, a lot of the snow accumulates on the top of the trees and then evapotranspires up. If it falls between the trees in small openings, it is shaded and stays there longer. That's going to help you in the spring. And then, of course, soil moisture stress, fire protection plans need to be in place in order to make sure you can do this. So the cause of fire, wildfire, in Canada is about 55 people and 45 lightning. In Russia, it's about 70% people. In Australia, it's about 90% people. In the Amazon, it's 100% people. And I want you to be aware, for our colleague in Brazil, this is a huge issue globally, because the Amazon has a huge impact globally on all the climate factors. So we need to start thinking about the traditional approach versus our new ecological approach. So the traditional approach is the engineers have been told to protect us from all these climatic events. And they have generally done a pretty good job. You know, they protected you from engineering by building structures to protect you from floods. They help you with new water supplies for the drought and so on. But the idea was, for storms, get the water off the land as quickly as possible and put it into conveyance, like pipes, structures, channels, to get rid of it to the lowland. So now what we need to do is we need to take the natural approach and say, can we mimic nature a bit more? Can we spread this water and retain it in the soil and in the ground and in the vegetation, allow it to infiltrate, detain it, accommodate runoff like nature does in many parts, to use the soil, wetlands, and buffers. So the control is control the peak flow. In other words, that's what the engineers told us. Now we say we have to accept the peak, but we're going to have to try to retain it by infiltration and detention. Resist disturbance. That's what the engineer said. We need to build resistance to disturbance. And now we say we need to build nature to absorb the disturbance. Improve the predictive capacity. Well, some of this stuff is unpredictable. Rigid structures and boundaries are no longer the norm. We should have flexible boundaries, and stability, seek stability is no longer the case, because we now have a new unstable environment because of climate change. So this is what we did traditionally. This is what we should be doing more. Now, we can't just do this alone. We need to kind of collaborate with these two types of things. And this is what we call low impact design, LID. You'll hear that a lot, low impact design or green infrastructure. So how do we restore some of these damaged watersheds? Because we have already done all kinds of problems to the stream banks and everything else. So here are a number of things which you can actually do to help the river absorb these unusual events. You can build an overhang, you can plant riparian vegetation, you can complex the stream, you can increase gravel deposits, you can fence the stream from animals, you can have side channels and so on. So how can you actually do this? Here's some examples. You want to build some overhangs that the fish can hide underneath it. And so you can actually do this. The purpose is to protect the banks from erosion, provide fish cover, introduce complexity and nutrient cycling and so on. So you can actually construct the river banks in such a way that you some bank stabilization by riprap and so on. That's the plan, and this is why you want to do it, and this is how you do it. Look at what we have done in the streams. We always removed all these trees, trunks from the stream, and now we put them back in. Why? Because in order to create biodiversity and new habitat and organic matter for fish and nutrients, it's actually good to keep some of these tree trunks in the river. But you have to kind of make sure they don't get washed by the intermediate storms. So here is how you can actually do that. You can actually put them in the river to create biodiversity. This is why you want to do it, and this is how you're going to do it. Fencing. It's very interesting because if you use the stream for drinking water, you don't want the animals to go in there and do all the pooping so that you have pathogen in your water. So you can actually keep the livestock away from your stream. And this is why you want to keep them away. And here is how you do it. But then the problem is, what happens if a farmer has land on both sides of your stream and the animals have to go across? Well, building bridges is expensive for a farmer. So a very interesting, innovative solution has been to build a fence in the headwaters and a fence in the low part, the upstream and the downstream part, and fill this passageway with gravel. Well, what happens is the animals don't like to go across the stream in gravel. So they spend very little time when they have to go across to get through the gravel. And this is a very easy and cheap solution for farmers who can't afford to build a bridge for the animals to cross the stream. And because the gravel absorbs the sediment to some extent, it doesn't create as much problem. I mentioned to you building wetlands is a very good thing. And here is all the purpose why you want to build all these wetland branch in the meandering part of your stream. And here is how you can actually do that. And here is the plan on where you can actually do it. And so this is a very interesting thing which community groups can actually do quite effectively. And we have lots of volunteers who are keen to help us with this type of activity. We actually encourage all the community groups to actually plant trees in the buffer zone to expand the buffer zone, create habitat, and then make sure all these reasons help you in the protection. Chaos. Okay. So here's the construction and why you want to do that. And again, community groups can actually take part in this quite effectively. And then you need to have these side channels. We have gotten rid of all these side channels, but these are the best things you can actually enhance. And enhancing those will not only help you with stormwater, but it will create huge habitat for all the aquatic organisms. And you can do this in all mountain streams. And in those which are undisturbed, you're obviously at an advantage. So building side channels takes a bit of an effort, but after you build it, this is what it looks like, and this has huge potential for all kinds of stream improvements, including sediment control, flood control, fish habitat, biodiversity, and obviously creating all kinds of wildlife activities. So a good wetland and a good buffer zone, don't do this in forestry, in headwater streams. Do something like this because it will facilitate huge amounts of improvements in your river basin. So the adaptive strategies for rivers and for water anywhere you go is, first of all, demand management. We need to reduce how much water we use in all of these activities. And remember, we are huge water consumers in the city. Agriculture uses about 70% of all the water. Recreation is a huge water consumer, and I will show you this tomorrow. Stormwater management, think of it, what you can do at the site. Think of what you can do in the neighborhood of your watershed, and think of what you can do in the watershed. If you think at the community level, you own property can do a lot to retain more water. The neighborhood has to do something different because in the neighborhood you got the roads and the parking lots to deal with, so you can do a lot of wetlands in that area to store that water. And the watershed level, you have to do all kinds of other things, and I'll show you that later. For drought management, we need allocation strategies on conservation as a temporary measure. In the long run, I'm not sure we will be able to deal with the drought management very well unless you have groundwater which is being recharged, which in many parts it is not. Hazard protection, you have probably heard of BMPs, best management practices. I would argue there is no such thing as a best management practice. They're only beneficial management practice. Nothing is best. All of them help a little bit, but they're all beneficial, but they're not the best. Neither am I. Rainwater harvesting is becoming a very popular thing, and that means you can actually, on your property, use a lot of that rainwater for all the stuff you do outdoors in the summer, which is when you use most of the water. I have 2 rain barrels in my garden, and I have a vegetable garden, and I never use the domestic water for my production. And of course, fire risk reduction is critical, and we start to need to reduce the fuel load and create fire breaks and all that kind of stuff. So if you want more information on the adaptive capacity of communities, here is what the Columbia Basin Trust has put up in terms of the website, in terms of what the community action plans are. They can give you much more details than what I told you. This is actually the community which was featured by the UN on how mountain communities can adapt to climate change. That's available on site. And then, of course, food security, virtual water, and increased climatic variability is another thing which I will address tomorrow afternoon, because since we are in a virtual communication network, we might as well talk about virtual water. So this is time for questions.
Thank you, Hans. We have already some questions. I will read them because they've already been written on the chat. The first one is from Antonio Malo Larea. He said, "Thank you for your presentation, first of all." And then the question is, I know that you told us that you don't talk about equity because you don't do social sciences. Anyway, I want you to ask if you know studies that make relations about land use changes, its impact over water and land property distribution, and the kind of property, public, communitarian, cooperative, or private. And he adds also, sorry for the question, because he does ecological economics.
Well, I'm sure some of our other colleagues can answer this much better than I do, but there are quite a lot of data sources now where we look at particularly legal allocation of water. The laws of water are just unbelievably bad. And when we talk about equity, the legal system which we use for allocating water is absolutely abysmal. In Canada, we have this law which says first in time, first in right, which means the people who came first, the settlers, they were allocated water for a certain amount from the river, and that water was allocated to perpetuity, which means they can use that forever. And now that was done at a time when climate change was never even on the horizon. And so when we talk about equity, we need to change this because this is completely different now. But the lawyers don't want to address this because try to change 5,000 people who have water rights. They're not going to give up their water rights. So in Australia, they tried to do this in the Murray-Darling River because they had this big drought. And then they had to force people to give up certain parts of the allocation. And this was written up, and it's a good example to look at. That was written up as a very successful way of reducing the amount of water allocated to everybody in terms of improving equity and to allow enough water for environmental services. That was done in the 2010-2012. And this was said, it's working, it's wonderful. You go back to the Murray-Darling today and you look at what they're saying now, they're saying it was not sufficient. Because of climate change, even that amount of reduction wasn't sufficient. In this last 2 years, they had the equal problem as they had before. Chile has a completely different water allocation law where they have a water market, so you can buy a water license, and whoever has more money can outbid somebody else. So what has happened in Chile, in many parts, and in Peru as well, the mining companies bought water licenses, and the indigenous communities didn't have enough resources to outcompete the mining companies. So there's a huge conflict starting with equity between indigenous communities and mining companies in Chile. So every country has different water laws, and water laws are the most archaic everywhere, and we need to change this in terms of climate change. So those are the kind of example I can give you about equity. There's far more in this area, but like I said, this is not my expertise, and I let some of the more intelligent people tell you about.
Thank you. Very, very nice answer. Thank you.
Okay. Now we have some questions from Lupa. I'm reading the first one. Is environmental variability in mountains and drylands as a result of climate change, or it still comes to intensive land use change?
Well, it's both, and it depends on the land use. if you have an undisturbed mountain environment, it's all climate change. If you have intensive use, be it forestry or agriculture or whatever, then of course it becomes a trade-off between the two. And if you go to very intensive land use, like the diagram I showed you with the surface runoff, then land use is probably more important than climate change. So in the urban environment, I'm convinced that 70-30. 70 is land use change, 30 is climate change. In the mountains, it's probably the opposite. It's probably 70% climate change and maybe 30%. That's very general. Every watershed is different, and every watershed has different land uses. So it's very hard to generalize, but use this as a kind of a general comparison.
Okay, so we are moving to the next one. Transhumance and mobility by shippers from lowlands to the top is one way of managing variability in resources. Is a form of adaptability or a form of managing mountain resources like pastures and water and herbs?
Start again. I didn't hear the third part.
The transhumance and mobility by shepherds from lowlands to the top is one way of managing variability in resources. Is a form of adaptability or a form of managing mountain resources like pastures, water, and herbs?
Well, yes, transhumance has been obviously an adaptive measure. You know, people move their cows up in the summer and take them down in the winter. That's a very good adaptive kind of adaptive management approach, and that should be encouraged. The big problem about adaptive things is when you look at tourism in mountain is also an adaptive kind of thing. You go there in the summer to cool down, or you go in the winter to ski, but this is much more disruptive. I don't think that's good transhumance, and I will show you that tomorrow. So yeah, I think that that's a good adaptive thing, which the indigenous communities have been doing for centuries.
Okay, so I read only one more. The other two, I suggest Lupa to submit directly to you by email, or I will submit to you because there are other questions. So
Yeah.
I read this one. Do you think wildfire intensification recently could be a result of low utilization of grassland, pastures, and forest dry mass for livestock productivity? Does it link to grazing restrictions and eradication in some of these ecosystems?
Well, I'm not going to answer this question because my next presentation is how to improve how to sequester CO2 in mountain environments. And that will address this question, hopefully, in much greater detail.
So we can go to another question from Lupa. Revegetating is good, but some of the tree species need to be considered. Introduction of trees, such as some species of prosopis, within dryland mountains will create difficult environments to manage.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I was working in a watershed in Ecuador, and it was a mountain watershed with lots of agriculture. And a Dutch businessman came in and offered the farmers a plan to say, we would rent your land, we will employ you for the next 30 years, and we plant tree for carbon credit in Holland. And we looked at the economics and it looked pretty good. The farmers would actually make more money by working in the forest, planting the forest and managing the forest. They would have 30 years of really good income. And then we asked him, well, what kind of trees are you going to plant? eucalyptus. This is probably the worst possible thing you can do, because eucalyptus are fast growing. You harvest them, so it doesn't really benefit the CO2. And after the second or third generation of eucalyptus, you can't grow anything because it has all kinds of contaminants creating conditions in soils which then doesn't allow other plants to grow. So you have to be extremely careful what kind of trees you want to plant. My approach to this whole reforestation is, why don't we think of agroforestry? And I will show you later on some examples of agroforestry which can actually be incredibly beneficial to all these kind of improved biodiversity, improved food supply, improved CO2 emission, and so on. So I hope I can address that later on. And yes, the question is quite correct. Be very careful what trees you do. And Giuseppe, the professor in forestry, will probably give you far better information than I can do, because he's the expert in all this.
Okay, thank you, Hans. So we have time for the last one. One thing we'd like to understand that is not coming out is the relationship between these climate activities on land use, population, and policy. This is good luck.
Well, I know, remember, we scientists are terrible communicators. We don't communicate very well. And it's interesting, we just started 2 years ago that all our graduate students now, when they come in, have to take a course in communication, because we have been unable to actually communicate our science to decision makers, policy people. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we're facing. And so I'm at fault because I'm not doing a great job either. And so you people need to do this at an incredibly fast rate, because now we're all on virtual communications. And this is the way which you can actually learn how to translate your really complicated scientific information, which is complex, so that the policymakers can understand. And my biggest problem is they always want 5 sentences of an answer to something which is so complicated it takes me several days to even explain the process. And so some people are far more clever than me to translate the very good science into communication, which is helpful to politicians. And so I would encourage you all to take a course in communication, because it will help your career tremendously. Maybe you're all super communicators already, so you don't have to do it.
Okay, I 100% agree concerning communication and scientists. Okay. Now we have a question from Gita from Nepal, and I'm trying to sum up because it's quite long, because there is also a comment, but we are running out of time. In Calicut, one of the mountainous district of Nepal, people have to walk for more than 4 to 5 hours to fetch a bucket of water for daily consumption. The sources of water have completely dried up. It is a huge challenge. What can be done for drought management in such areas?
Well, lo and behold, tomorrow afternoon, the last presentation is on water conservation, and I will show you a case study of 2 watersheds in Nepal, where we actually did a study where we talked to hundreds of people and found out what their problems are with water, how much time they spend to collect it, and what could we actually do about it. So I won't give you an answer right now, but hopefully I can address that to you tomorrow during the last presentation.
Okay, Hans, thank you very much. You deserve 2 minutes at least break. So I can stop recording now, and when you're ready, just let us know.
Okay.